So, I'll be continuing through Matthew's Gospel, and this is the sixth section overall of Matthew's Gospel, as I've broken it into sections. And this sixth section, as I've called it, is basically focused on Jesus' final visit to Jerusalem before his crucifixion. So that is roughly from the end of chapter 20 all the way through to the end of chapter 25. And I've titled this section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders. And when he gets there, that is the overall theme of his actions and his words in that time of his ministry. But as of now, we're focusing on a smaller part of that. We're focusing on, well, it's a pretty big part of it, but it's a part within all of that. It's a portion within section 6. This is the Olivet Discourse, which we call because it's a sermon Jesus gave on the Mount of Olives just outside of Jerusalem. This is a private sermon to his disciples answering some questions they had. So this is chapters 24 through 25. And that's where we've been for a while, and we have quite a ways to go even now. We've been trying to deal with this in a detailed way, and it's a difficult portion. So I'm just trying to make sure all possible questions get answered at some point. But in this sermon that Jesus gives, he is basically predicting and describing the destruction of Jerusalem's temple, his second coming, and the end of the age. Those are the major bullet points. Now, as of today, we've made it to passage number 7 in the Olivet Discourse. That again follows an outline that I've given you according to the way I've broken this into pieces. So today's passage is the parable of the fig tree, which I trust is pretty familiar. But let's read Matthew 24, verses 32 through 35 for the parable of the fig tree. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So in a portion of Scripture overflowing with phrases and passages difficult to understand and subject to many different interpretations among Christians, the parable of the fig tree is at least that same kind of thing, perhaps the utmost. I don't know. I don't know if I really want to have a poll for what passage in the Olivet Discourse is the most difficult one. This one might get it. I have 3 sermons planned on it, if that gives you an idea. So it's another passage here where Christians have said an awful lot, and they don't always agree. So we've got to work through those kinds of things. Now today in this sermon, I hope to clear away a lot of these difficulties, and I've got 4 headings that I think will do that. I'm focusing mainly on the predictive aspect, what Jesus is actually saying about the future. So in my first heading, I want to briefly mention 3 incorrect interpretations of this parable. So we're going to lead off with things I don't believe. I just want you to know that I don't believe them and why I don't believe them. And then for my second heading, I want to address another interpretation, which I also don't think is correct, but it needs a little bit more time to itself. So again, in that second heading, I am still telling you things I don't believe and why I don't believe them. I just want to do that a little more deliberately in that second heading because that's a bit of a more difficult aspect of all this. So anyway, halfway through the sermon, I still haven't told you anything that I actually believe. So that's where the third heading comes in. And I'll tell you my own view of this passage, in which I think Christ promises that his generation would see every predicted event before his return, but does not promise that they will see his return. And if you're looking for any real meat in what my sermon is actually getting at in terms of ideas, that's it. Christ promises that his generation will see every predicted event before his return, but does not promise they will see his return. And I will get into all of that at that time. But at the very end, for my fourth heading, I will argue that Christ has given us this parable so that every generation of Christian can hope and should hope, but merely hope in his immediate return. So if you're looking for a so what, that's the so what. I'm going to end on what really I think the purpose of Jesus was in telling this parable. So my sermon title for today is Pruning the Fig Tree, because that feels like most of what I'm doing in this sermon. I'm kind of trying to clear away all this stuff that Christians have kind of thrown on here, and we need to clear it away and kind of get down to what Jesus is actually saying. So we're pruning the fig tree. You know, pruning is where you come to a tree and kind of snip off the branches that shouldn't be there and are just, you know, soaking up life from the tree without actually doing any good. So we're trying to prune down the fig tree to get to what Jesus was actually trying to say in this parable. So let's start at that first goal I had. I want to talk about 3 incorrect views of this passage, why I think they're incorrect. These are somewhat rapid fire, so we're going to get them out of the way at the very beginning. The first incorrect interpretation of this parable is that Christ did return during the first generation of the church, just not in the way we would expect. You do encounter this kind of thing every so often among Christians, certain branches of Christianity, but it's not a typical thing, but it does happen that people say this kind of stuff. And some people will argue that Jesus was predicting that he would return so that even his disciples, while they're still alive, would see his return. The catch is, it's not his return the way you often think of the second coming of Christ. Now, as you might have guessed already, this is how a full preterist would read this passage. You know, full preterism is something we've talked about. These are people who think that everything Jesus is describing here in the Olivet Discourse happened back then in the first century, and that we should interpret this sermon accordingly as Jesus preaches it. So very often there are Christians of that persuasion, the full preterist view, who will assert that the coming of the Son of Man, described in the Olivet Discourse, which we've already seen as we've gone through all of this, that is just a symbolic description of judgment on Jerusalem and things that God was doing way back then. And they'll say that, therefore, Jesus can tell this parable of the fig tree. He can promise his disciples, yes, you know, you're going to see my return, and mean that. And he was right in saying that, because his return was just judgment on Jerusalem and those kinds of things. I've already talked about this kind of stuff. I've already talked about full preterism almost as much as I plan to. There's a little bit more I want to say about it down the road. But for the most part, I've told you why I think this is a very problematic way of viewing the Olivet Discourse, and I've gone over all of that with you. So we're going to move on from this incorrect interpretation to another one. The second incorrect interpretation of this parable is that the fall of Jerusalem and the second coming are mixed together in the mind of Jesus. So when I say mixed together, I mean they are separate events. You know, judgment falls on Jerusalem in this way, in this time, and then at some later point, Christ does return. They're separate events, but as Jesus looks into the future, he doesn't see a clear distinction between the two events. Therefore, they're mixed together. Therefore, he talks about them as one thing. So in this interpretation, throughout the Olivet Discourse, not just the parable of the fig tree, but throughout the entire Olivet Discourse, Jesus is actually thinking of both events. But because he does not see clearly the distinction between them in time, he kind of talks about them both all at once as he's going through the Olivet Discourse. This would be very similar to what very often happens in the Old Testament. I don't know if you've read the Old Testament and you think about what the prophets are saying in those passages. You might think to yourself, you know, sometimes I think Jeremiah is talking about both the first coming of Jesus and the second coming of Jesus at once. And you're right to think that, because sometimes that does happen. Very often I think those prophets don't see clearly the distinctions in time between everything that God was going to do in the future. So what they're telling you is true, but it is kind of jumbled up. And it's only as time goes on that we get more clarity on that as we see what God actually does in the future. It's very common for the Old Testament, but some people have now come to the Olivet Discourse and say that Jesus is doing the same thing, that even he doesn't see clearly the distinction between judgment on Jerusalem there in the first century and his second coming later on. So as he talks about these things, they're all thrown together. So some parts of the Olivet Discourse are more for the judgment on Jerusalem, and some of the things in the Olivet Discourse are more for the second coming, but Jesus doesn't see clearly between them, so they're all thrown together. Now, they think that that's okay to do that because they consider, usually they'll go on to say, Christians who believe this, that the judgment on Jerusalem and the things happening at that time are a type, are a foreshadowing of what's coming later when Jesus actually does return. They're so similar, and one does kind of signify the other in some small way, that it's fitting to put them both together. So that's their understanding of why Jesus would do that and why it's okay that that is what has happened. So based on this, the parable could be read, the parable of the fig tree that is, could be read as though it had more to do with the fall of Jerusalem, which did happen in the first generation of Christianity. And therefore, Jesus can tell his disciples, you're going to see all these things take place. Well, and when he tells the parable of the fig tree, he's thinking more of that first event, the fall of Jerusalem. And therefore, they did see that, and therefore Jesus was right. If that sounds kind of complicated and maybe not a good way to read the passage, I agree with you. I think it is very messy and unnecessarily messy. And you might have noticed that I have not mentioned this particular interpretation to you at all until this point. I have made it through 31 verses of the Olivet Discourse. Not a small chunk there. I've made it all this way without even mentioning to you that some Christians view the Olivet Discourse as this kind of mixture of stuff, and Jesus didn't see a fine distinction between it all. The reason I've not mentioned it is because I haven't needed to. When you read the Olivet Discourse, for the most part, I think things do fall pretty plainly between the fall of Jerusalem and the second coming of Christ. I don't think we need this interpretation to understand the Olivet Discourse. And to bring it in to explain one parable in the Olivet Discourse, the parable of the fig tree, I think is just unnecessary, unhelpful, and I don't agree with it at all. And I think as we go into the rest of the Olivet Discourse, as this series progresses at a snail's pace, you'll see that we don't need to come back to this ever again. It's just, I don't think it's a necessary tool to understand what Jesus is doing in the Olivet Discourse. So it's just unhelpful to bring it in. So I don't follow that way of viewing the Olivet Discourse. I don't follow that way of viewing the parable of the fig tree. I just throw it out. So there's the second incorrect view of the parable of the fig tree and also the entire Olivet Discourse for that matter. All right, third incorrect view that I again just want to mention briefly. So some Christians think that Christ had in mind a contingent prediction. And I'm throwing a big word at you because I have to. I don't know any other word that really does what I'm trying to do here. A contingent prediction. So a prediction is contingent if its fulfillment depends on something else happening first. Right? So in order for my prediction to come true, if I make a prediction, there has to be something else that happens first. If that doesn't happen, my prediction will not come true. If it does happen, then my prediction will come true. That's the whole idea of contingency when we come to the idea of prophecy. Now, when it comes to the parable of the fig tree and Jesus telling his disciples that they will see all these things, the idea here with this interpretation is that he does mean to include in that his second coming. He does mean to tell his disciples that they will see his return. But according to this interpretation, there's an if there. There has to be something else that happens first in order to guarantee that Christ would return in the first generation of Christianity so that his disciples would see him return. And if you're wondering what that something is, what the contingent element is, usually Christians that follow this point of view point to worldwide evangelism, which Jesus has mentioned earlier in the Olivet Discourse, verse 14. He says, "This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." That sounds like a contingent factor, right? It's like if the gospel goes out to the whole world, then the end will come. And if it happens in the first century, that means Jesus can return in the first century. And some Christians come here to the parable of the fig tree, and they say, yes, Jesus was promising his disciples that they would see his return way back then, but The world was not fully evangelized, the church was asleep at the wheel, and we didn't get the job done. Therefore, Jesus could not return, and we're still waiting, for the total evangelism of the world. Now, the Bible does contain contingent predictions. We could go back to the Old Testament and see some things like that, where there is an if included in prophecies, and they may not come to pass if certain things don't happen. Usually that's because of the mercy of God that doesn't happen. But in this case, in the parable of the fig tree, I don't think that's what Jesus means. I don't think that's what's happening here. And the main reason I don't think that is because the only contingency they can bring in is worldwide evangelism, which, and again, we've talked about this before, it's strange to think of it, but the first generation of Christianity thought of that task as completed. The way they talk about evangelism and the spread of the gospel, they talk about it as though they have accomplished that mission. Paul has one of the more notable passages on this, which I'll read to you again. I've read this before. This is Colossians 1, verses 3 through 6. He says, "We give thanks to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, praying always for you, since we heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and the love which you have for all the saints, because of the hope laid up for you in heaven, of which you previously heard in the word of truth, the gospel, which has come to you, just as in all the world also it is constantly bearing fruit and increasing, even as it has been doing in you also since the day you heard of it and understood the grace of God in truth." The way Paul thinks of the spread of the gospel, it's already reached the whole world. Now, you can quibble over whether it's right to call, a huge chunk of the Roman Empire the world, but the way they thought of it, the gospel had spread to a whole bunch of nations, and they viewed the worldwide task of evangelism basically as complete, which means that you can't really say it didn't happen in the first century. So you can't really, biblically speaking, in terms of the New Testament, you can't use that as an excuse to explain why Jesus didn't come back in the first century, which the whole thing then becomes a little bit sloppy, which again is why I don't think this is the right way to read the parable of the fig tree. To say that he was promising he would return in the lifetime of his first disciples, but it didn't happen because they didn't get the job of evangelism done. Well, the church did a lot in the first century. Paul did a lot, and the gospel did reach a lot of nations to the point where they viewed it as a worldwide task, and it was basically done. So I don't think that's a fair way to read this passage. I don't think it works very well. So again, those are just three ways that you'll sometimes hear Christians understand the parable of the fig tree, and just very briefly why I don't think those are the right way to read the passage. I just wanted to get all those out of the way before we reach the really big incorrect interpretation that I want to talk about, which is where we're going now in my second heading. Those first three, they're kind of easily dismissed. I don't think it's very difficult to see the problems with those. But for my second heading, I need to address this other incorrect interpretation a little more deliberately and give a bit stronger correction, because this one is much more common and much more annoying to me personally. Just so I'm going to rant for the next section of this sermon here. So according to this other incorrect view of the passage, the one that I dislike enough to give it a special part of my sermon, Christ promises that Christians who see Israel once again become a free, independent state will also see Christ return. So that's the interpretation I'm disagreeing with right now. So Christ promises that Christians who see Israel become a free, independent state will also see Christ return. So according to this view, the branches of the fig tree becoming tender and the growing of leaves was fulfilled in 1948 when the nation of Israel declared itself a free, independent state for the first time in over 2,000 years. So remembering your history, Israel was not an independent nation for a very, very long time, but there came a point in 1948 where they said, we're declaring our independence from everybody, and a lot of people didn't like that. Some people really liked that. Americans typically usually have liked that, but a lot of the world didn't, and so Israel has kind of been on walking on eggshells with most of the world for a very long while. But in 1948, they declared their independence. They became a free state. And according to some Christians, that's what Jesus is talking about here with the fig tree having tender branches and leafy leaves being borne on its branches. Also, according to this view, when Jesus refers to this generation in the parable of the fig tree, he means the generation alive in 1948 to see Israel become a free, independent state. So when he says that this generation will see all these things take place, he's looking ahead to a future generation, the generation that was alive in 1948, to see Israel become a free state once again. Therefore, the promise made by Jesus, allegedly, is that he would return soon enough after 1948 for that same generation to see him return. In a sense, it's another contingent prediction, right? It's like, hey, once Israel becomes a free state, then I'm able to return. And so we've been waiting around for that until 1948 when that happened. And now, finally, the doomsday clock can start and all that kind of thing that you'll sometimes hear Christians talk about. So that's the incorrect view that I am disagreeing with right now in the sermon. Christ promises that Christians who see Israel once again become a free, independent state will also see Christ return. So this view became the standard view of the fig tree parable among American Christians after World War II. This is not the kind of thing that you'll read about for most of church history, I don't think. I've not really encountered it in older writings, but after World War II, especially here in the United States, this is pretty much the way of reading the passage, and a lot of Christians just kind of assume that that is the case. I have three really big problems with this interpretation, and probably more, but there are three that I'm going to tell you, so here we go. One problem with this view is that it focuses on the statehood of Israel seemingly by random choice. It's like, why are we focusing on the statehood of Israel in particular for this parable? Now, in my next sermon, I will argue, I do think the fig tree does represent Israel in some way. I think that's valid. I think there are reasons to say that. I agree with those reasons. However, after we make that connection to Israel and say the fig tree represents Israel, we still need to determine what about Israel is represented by the fig tree. What about Israel is represented by the branches becoming tender and the leaves coming onto the branches? What about Israel in particular does Jesus have in mind? Now, out of all the possible options, this interpretation has focused on one, and that is statehood. Something that doesn't really come out a whole lot, even in the biblical sense of things. You would think that something more spiritual would be in view, something a little closer to the heart of God. But oh no, statehood. It's the statehood of Israel that Jesus has in mind, talking about the fig tree becoming leafy and its branches becoming tender. But they provide no argument for that. I have never yet seen any Christian provide an argument for why we should view the statehood of Israel, their freedom from other surrounding nations, having their own government to govern themselves. I've never seen any Christian make an argument from Scripture for why we should view that as the main idea of the parable of the fig tree. And, I can't argue against no argument. I mean, if you're not going to present reasons, I have no reason to believe them, and I can't even say much about it, except to say that they're not providing an argument for that. It's kind of empty. Well, I have another problem with this interpretation, and that is that Christ always uses the phrase, this generation, to refer to his own generation and not future generations. That is consistent. Now, in order to save time, I'm going to leave this to you and your concordances or your smartphones, depending on how you study the Bible these days. But I will leave it to you to search the phrase, this generation, and you will see that in the Gospels, Jesus always uses it for the people standing in front of him at that moment. Like he is always using it for the people alive during his ministry. So this generation probably does refer to his disciples standing there and those who would join them soon after in the church. So first century, for sure. Does not refer to a far distant future generation like in 1948 or whatever year in the future. It doesn't refer to a future generation. It's the generation alive during his ministry. It's a huge problem there. Third problem, speaking of generations, this is where I get really angry, so we'll try not to scream. I'll try to save my voice for later. So my third problem with this incorrect view is that no one can refute it because it allows so much ambiguity. There's so much about this interpretation that is deliberately unclear. You can't really get your hands on it and really soundly refute it. And you'll see what I mean as we talk about this word generation. So here's a question for you. How long is a generation? How long would you say in terms of time? You know, a generation is actually a group of people, you know, who come about in a certain time, but how long is that time? How long is a generation? Is it 10 years when a generation is growing up in their formative years and they're soaking in the world as it is at that time and becoming a certain kind of people, where we can speak about Generation X and millennials and all these people? Is it 10 years? Or is it perhaps 20 years when that generation has matured and given birth to the next generation and they're beginning to pass the torch to a new generation? Is it 20 years maybe? Or perhaps is it 40 years when that generation reaches middle age and they're beginning to fade out and they're starting to become irrelevant? I know, kind of sad, isn't it? You know, to be at this point in life and see the world getting away from you. But is it 40 years? Is it at that point? Or is a generation 80 years, by which time that generation is dying out and to the point where they're just not going to exist beyond that point? You know, what's the year marker? How many years is a generation? How do we reckon it in that sense? Well, I give you that long list of options, not only to show you how vague it is to speak of a generation as a marker of time, but also because this interpretation has made convenient use of all those definitions. They have cycled through every single one of them. In the beginning, preachers said that Christ would return within 10 years after Israel became a state. So that'd be 1958. Guess what? That didn't happen. Jesus didn't return. So then preachers started saying, well, 20 years. Generation is 20 years. And then that didn't come about either. Christ did not return at that time. So guess what? 40 years. A generation is 40 years. And now you got preachers that are holding out for the 80-year mark because we realize that at none of these points has Jesus actually returned. It's humorous and just frustrating to read older commentaries on this because every so often they change what a generation is. The preachers do, because they have to account for the fact that Jesus has not yet returned after all these years, after Israel became a state again. It's amazing. Every time you try to criticize this interpretation by saying, hey, look, you gave this year mark, but Jesus didn't return, they just say, well, I was wrong about what a generation means. We're going to extend the marker. We're going to move the goalpost. We're going to do this kind of stuff. It's pretty amazing. And you know what? There are some preachers that are even bolder than that. They'll go further to protect this interpretation and resist admitting that they were wrong by claiming that the year 1948 is not what Jesus had in mind, but 1967. You know what happened in 1967? The State of Israel successfully took control of Jerusalem again, because before that point they didn't actually have any control over the city. They eventually did in 1967. And then people come along and say, well, that's the year Jesus had in mind. That's what Jesus means by the branches of the fig tree becoming tender and putting forth leaves. That's what Jesus had in mind. Again, no argument for it, no reason why we should think of, the state of Jerusalem, being the thing Jesus has in mind in this passage. But hey, it's a year marker a bit later on that allows us to tack on 80 more years to allow for Jesus to return and not admit that we were wrong in our overall interpretation. This is the kind of stuff you deal with on this interpretation. It is annoying. For someone like me, I try to have my facts right. I try to make sure that I've got a good logical argument from those facts so that I can come to you in these sermons and say, look, here's what I think, here's why I think it, here are the objections, I've dealt with the objections. But these people are just like, yeah, 10 years, no, 20 years, 40 years. Did I say 40? I meant 80 years. And it's not even 1948, it's 1967. How do you handle the Bible that way? Like that, this is not a time to play fast and loose with the facts and guesswork. This is Scripture. And it's just like, there comes a point where you have to admit that your interpretation is so vague and so subject to all these different question marks that it's just not good. It's not right to do that. This interpretation, on the one hand, can never actually be proven wrong because you can always move the beginning date and you can always lengthen the time of a generation to make it work. But just because you can't prove it wrong doesn't mean it's a good interpretation. It might be that you can't prove it wrong because it defies all logic, and that's what's going on here. It just allows preachers to play around with details and say things that sound like really good and biblical, but in reality, they're just stalling because they've been proven wrong, for the past X number of years, and they got to find another way to, kind of take the pressure off of them, so they alter the interpretation to make it fit the march of time. It's just really annoying. The ambiguity, the vagueness of this interpretation makes it pretty much worthless, and that's why I reject it. So I don't want any of you to ever think about the passage that way. Please don't. And if you ever do come to that opinion, just don't tell me. Just let me die in my ignorance, believing at least that I swayed you away from this wrong view of the passage. All right, well, it's been half the sermon so far, and now I finally get to tell you things I actually do believe about the parable of the fig tree. So here's my own view. This is my third heading for today. I did not invent this interpretation. This isn't mine in the sense that I created it. It's just the one I believe. Other Christians do believe this about the passage, but it's my view, and because I actually believe this particular way of viewing the fig tree. So in my view, Christ promises that his generation will see every predicted event before his return, but he does not promise that they will see his return. So again, Christ promises that his generation will see every predicted event before his return. The fall of Jerusalem, the birth pangs, tribulation of the church, all of that. He promises them that they will see all those things, but he does not actually promise that they will see his return, which of course is why it's not a problem that Jesus hasn't come back yet, which is the big problem people have with this passage. All right, so on the one hand, as I said, other Christians believe this, not just me, but I do believe this one. I do want to argue for it. I have gone back and forth a little bit for this sermon on how to present my view, and the reason for that is because on the one hand, I believe this interpretation is actually really simple. I mean, over and against all the complicated stuff I have covered with you so far in this sermon, I think my view is actually very easy, which, man, the simplest explanation is usually the best. So on the one hand, I don't want to just sit here and talk about it forever because I think it is that simple. On the other hand, I have to admit a lot of Christians just don't see it. I mean, they read the passage for 40 years and they still don't see what in my mind is just like plainly staring out from the passage. So part of me wants to really belabor this point to make sure you see it. So I'm kind of torn on how to go about this. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to give you a simple explanation, but also give you a handout that you can sit and stare at for however long you need to when you go home, so that if you don't see it by the time I'm done talking, maybe you'll see it eventually as you sit and stare at this thing. So trying to compromise in my way of approaching the passage here. So in today's passage, here's my simple explanation. There is a key phrase in this passage, and that phrase is all these things. It is the most important phrase in this passage. And you see it twice in verses 33, and you see it again in 34. So it's once in 33, once in 34. So when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. This is a key phrase in the passage. Now in verse 33, Jesus indicates that all these things will precede the second coming, just as a fig tree's branches and leaves indicate the nearness of summer. That's the analogy. Let's back up to verse 32, actually. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So, you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Okay, that's the analogy. Just as the state of the fig tree's branches and leaves indicate that summer is near, so all these things indicate that the second coming is about to happen. Okay, that's the analogy. Now, as a reminder, all these things refers to what we've read about in the Olivet Discourse, We've seen the birth pangs, which are the normal kind of recurring problems of the world, wars, rumors and wars, famines, earthquakes, those kinds of things. We've also seen the tribulation of the church, a situation in which Christians are going to be persecuted by the nations. There's going to be false prophets and false messiahs. All this trouble for Christians because they are Christians. Also, there's the great tribulation of Judea, the fall of Jerusalem to the Romans in the year AD 70 and all the surrounding events there. Those are all these things that Jesus has described. Now, the key detail to remember in verse 33 is that all these things, that is therefore separate from the second coming. Like, those are different things. The second coming is not included in all these things. Let's read it again. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. So all these things is the first half of the verse. He is near, right at the door is the second part of the verse. Those are separate things in this particular verse. So the second coming of Christ, his return, is not included in all these things. Those are separate categories. So then in verse 34, the verse that makes everyone scratch their head, we see this. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And Christians look at that and say, well, if he promises that, then why hasn't he returned? Because all these things does not include the second coming. He's promising them that they're going to see all this other stuff he's been talking about. The birth pangs, the tribulation of the church, the great tribulation of Judea. All that stuff. His disciples are going to see those things. He promises them that. But that does not include his return. That does not include the second coming. Verse 34 actually makes no mention of the second coming at all. He only talks about all these things, which, as we've already seen from verse 33, does not include the second coming. So altogether, Christ promises that his generation will see every predicted event before his return, but does not promise that they will see his actual return. They're going to see a lot of stuff. They're going to see the birth pangs. They're going to see the tribulation of the church. They're going to see the fall of Jerusalem and the great tribulation of Judea. And they did see all those things. We've talked about that already in the Olivet Discourse. They saw all of that stuff start to come about, but he does not promise them the second coming in their lifetime. And that's it. And I think that's very, very simple. But there are a lot of people that just don't see that immediately. And to some degree, I understand that. I sympathize with that problem. And if you're like me, and you need to stare at something for a half an hour before you actually get it, because I'm very much that way. Sometimes I just got to sit there and look at something before my mind actually makes sense of it. If you're that kind of person like me, that's where this handout comes in. I hope this will be helpful to you. On the handout, you can see that I have divided the passage into two columns. I hope it's not too busy for you to make sense of it here, but the whole passage is on there. I've just split parts of it into columns here, one on the right side, one on the left. Please note you can still read the whole passage by reading from left to right generally as you go down on the page. That's why I put the arrows on there, so you can follow along the flow of thought there. But on the left-hand side, you see the tender branches and the leaves along with what they represent, all these things. I've put all of that on the left-hand side. Meanwhile, on the right-hand side, you see the summer and what the summer represents, which is the second coming. So all of that on the right-hand side of the page. I've also color-coded some of the details. The first events are all red, whether that's the branches and the leaves changing, or all these things in the Olivet Discourse. Meanwhile, the later events are all blue, whether that's the summer drawing near or the second coming drawing near. So all those things are color-coded in blue, so your eye catches those things and puts them together a little more easily. Finally, I've underlined some common phrases in both columns. On the left-hand side, all these things is underlined twice, and then is near on the right-hand side is also underlined, just so you see that he has this very carefully structured. I mean, Jesus put some thought into how he worded this. He made it very clear in his repetition what he's talking about. Now, my hope is that you will see in this passage what I see if you can see, it's spread out with maybe some visual aids, which is the purpose of all of this. This is a visual aid to help you see what I see. And the main thing I want you to see is that verse 34 has nothing in the column for the second coming. So as you read the passage down, you come through verse 32, verse 33, you get to verse 34, there is nothing in that second column under the summer and the second coming. Like, it's not there. That's why I have X's in there, because Jesus doesn't say anything there. He has this back and forth contrast, and then he stops. He does not go on to include the summer or the second coming in what he promises. He just says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. But he doesn't include anything, from the summer second coming column in there. And hopefully, just staring at this maybe for a few minutes will let you realize how significant that is. There is no promise made to the disciples that they will see the second coming of Jesus. A lot of Christians have a huge problem with this passage because they think it means he's promising that the first generation of disciples would see the second coming. But he didn't promise that. Maybe you just get lost in all the words that are there, but he doesn't promise that. He promises them that they'll see all these things, which is everything short of the second coming. So go home and stare at this for a few minutes if you need to, and hopefully it will make sense of you. But that is my argument, that Christ promises that his generation would see every event before his return, but he does not promise them that they will see his return. He left that somewhat open-ended, which brings me to my fourth and final heading for today. So I'm going to argue here at the end that Christ has given us this parable so that every generation of Christian can hope and should hope, but merely hope in the immediate return of Jesus. And all of those phrases matter, that we can hope and should hope, but merely hope in his immediate return. Now, if my preferred view of this passage brings any objection, it's that the parable seems to have no value according to the way I understand it. What is good? What good is it? Let's put it this way. What good is it to any generation of Christian that God would be busy in fulfilling his promises rapid fire for a few decades and then potentially leave us hanging for the true purpose of it all, with the return of Christ? Because that is what happened in history. As I've showed you earlier in the Olivet Discourse series here, all this stuff that Jesus talked about really did come to pass there in the first few decades after his resurrection. And now we're just still waiting for the final part of it that really, really matters to us, and that is his return. What good is it that Jesus would say that kind of thing? What good is it that God has done it this way? Well, to answer that objection, I'll argue that Christ has given us this parable so that every generation is kind of on the same page. They can all hope in the return of Christ very soon. They all should hope for that, but their hope is merely a hope rather than a certainty in his immediate return. So let's break those phrases down and just show you what I mean by that. And this is my explanation for why Jesus even bothered telling this parable and making the promise the way he made it. So first of all, every generation of Christian can hope that Christ will return soon. Every generation, from the first generation all the way to our generation and beyond us if Christ delays in returning. We can all hope that Christ will return soon. This conclusion flows naturally from the fact that the generation number one was able to see fulfillment of all these things. The birth pangs, the church's tribulation, the great tribulation of Judea. Because God has checked off all those boxes, there's nothing hindering Christ from coming back. Not even the evangelism of the whole world. To some degree, the New Testament views that as a done deal. So even that's not holding him back, if you want to add something else in there. Therefore, generation number one, the first disciples, they had every reason to hope that they might in fact see Christ return. As for the rest of us, generation 2 and onward to the present, and perhaps beyond us, we can also hope in this return because all those things were fulfilled. Time doesn't change what happens in the past, so all these things were still fulfilled, the birth pangs and all that. So there's nothing to reverse any of this. The result is that Jesus has woven hope into his entire church from the very beginning, from the very first generation, so that every single generation of Christian can hope in his return. So from generation number 1 onward, we can all equally hope that Christ may in fact return in our lifetimes. Secondly, we should be hoping for that. And this is kind of where we get into your will needs to get involved. You need to psych yourself up for this. You got to make yourself hope in this way. And every generation should hope this way, and Jesus tells this parable to allow us to do that. Our greatest enemy is perhaps the temptation to fall asleep while waiting, kind of like the disciples did in Gethsemane, where they couldn't stay awake and pray with him leading up to his crucifixion. Well, our temptation is to kind of forget that Jesus might be coming back, and we start living our lives in ways that aren't pleasing to him. Well, we've got to be ready for his return. We ought to be ready for his return at any moment. And just to read a little bit later in the Olivet Discourse, we'll get into all this later, but verse 42 says, "Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will." We should be on high alert. And to help us be on high alert, Jesus tells his first generation of disciples they're going to see all this other stuff come to pass so that all the boxes are checked, and he really could come at any moment. So here and now, studying this passage, we can look at these things and say, wow, Jesus actually could return at any moment. I need to be ready. So this allows us to get our minds in the right frame for being ready for the return of Christ, ready for the thief, so we aren't taken by surprise whenever he does return. But to end all this, you have to point out that our hope should merely be hope as opposed to certainty that Christ will return in our lifetimes. And I say this against the Christians that try to set dates and time limits for when Jesus may return. Jesus speaks against them as well. You see here in verse 36, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." So if any generation of Christians says, well, we have reason to believe that Christ will return now, the thing is, they have to immediately observe, after they have said that every generation of Christian has been able to say that. Generation 1, Generation 2, Generation 3, all the way down the line. Every single generation could have said to itself, well, we have reason to believe Jesus will return now. And for 2,000 years, that hasn't really come to anything, has it? So that there's a bit of humility there that works into all this, the way Jesus tells this parable. You can call that vague, to use a word that I threw against one of these other interpretations, but this actually has a purpose. Rather than just preachers covering their tracks so they never get proven wrong, this has a purpose. This brings a sense of humility as well as that sense of alertness that I was talking about. Every generation of Christian is on a level playing field. We can all hope that Christ will return in our lifetimes, but our hope is just that. Hope, not certainty. We can't go out there and say, well, I know Jesus is going to return in my lifetime. No, you don't know that. You know, that what Jesus has said here is not sufficient to prove that. He can come back at any time, but not necessarily in your lifetime. We have no evidence of that. So, this is not an empty promise. I don't think my understanding of this passage is empty in that sense of the word. I think it does have value. I think through the parable of the fig tree, Jesus allows us to hope. He encourages us to hope, but he warns us against doing more than hope. He warns us against setting dates and things like that. So he puts every generation of Christian on that level playing field. So with all that, let's review, and then we'll be done for today. I went through 4 headings here. 2 of them were kind of similar. The first thing I did was I briefly mentioned 3 interpretations that I thought were incorrect for the parable of the fig tree. I talked about the full preterist view. I talked about the whole idea where the second coming and the fall of Jerusalem are mixed together, and then also the contingent prediction view. I talked about all those and said why I don't think those are right. Then in my second heading, I specifically mentioned probably the more common interpretation among modern American Christians, the idea that basically Jesus is talking about the generation that sees Israel become a state or reclaim Jerusalem, depending on how they handle it. And I went through the reasons why I don't think that's a right view. And then I got into my own view. And I said that the purpose here, Christ promises that his generation would see every event predicted before his return, but not promising them that they would see his actual return. And I base that on the way Jesus uses this phrase, all these things, here in this passage. It does not include the second coming. It includes everything leading up to the second coming, but not the second coming. And then finally, I argued that Christ has given us this parable so that every Christian, every generation of Christian, can hope and should hope, but merely hope in his immediate return. And that is what I mean by pruning the fig tree. A lot of pruning, a lot of stuff lying scattered on the ground around me up here. I hope that makes the passage more understandable, a little more helpful, less intimidating. I hope that's the case. Next time, now that we've pruned the fig tree, we get to harvest from the fig tree. In that sermon, I'll explain why Jesus chose a fig tree for the parable, what that represents, how Israel relates to that, and we'll go from there next time when I come back to this passage. Now, this coming Sunday is the 19th, right? So I'm planning to do kind of my pre-Christmas sermon at that time. So it'll be a couple weeks before we get around to this again, but we'll get back to this eventually, the parable of the fig tree. Okay, are there questions or comments?